I'm Indy Nidell, and this is Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in my chair of wisdom and answer your questions about the First World War. Reed Perry asks, Out of the Trenches question, how did shooting at the opposing trenches work when there wasn't an ongoing offensive? Was there a fire-at-will command that allowed soldiers to fire at the opposing enemy line when they saw an enemy soldier? Or perhaps a time slot in the day when they were allowed to shoot? Or was it only at the express command of an officer? Seems like the soldiers wouldn't want to stick their heads over the trenches to spot the enemy. But I would imagine that the officers would want to keep up some form of pressure on the enemy. Or was the job of keeping up pressure given to the machine guns? Aha! It depends on the front line and on the officers in charge. In a lot of frontline areas, there were long periods of silence where there were no offensives planned or where the soldiers on both sides came to some sort of agreement with each other. There, the officers themselves had experienced cycle after cycle of coming into the trenches and living in constant danger, which really can wreck your psyche over time. So sooner or later, a soldier, someone who spoke the language of the enemy, might shout something across no man's land like, hey, let's not shoot at each other from this evening until noon tomorrow so everyone can get some sleep, or something like that, or so they can eat in peace, or things like of that nature. And the other side would often agree to this since they were in exactly the same situation. Now, this was the live and let live system, and it had its own set of rules, like both sides might throw their grenades in a certain conveniently unoccupied trench area so they could still report back to their superiors that they fought the enemy, but still kept the unofficial peace. Such little agreements did happen all the time in quieter areas. In other areas where the officers were maybe on a tighter leash by their superiors or specially tasked to keep up the aggressiveness, they would have snipers and mortar teams to constantly harass the enemy by shooting at everything that moved, even if it was just to deprive the enemy of sleep. The normal rifleman was certainly allowed to shoot at will at the enemy in those areas. But since the other side most certainly would shoot back, it wasn't always a good idea. Guard duty in those hot zones was usually nerve-wracking enough without going the extra yard. Corbin Lubianski asks, Hi Indy, my question for Out of the Trenches is how did France's plan for the dissolution of Germany change as the war progressed? Also, what are some other countries' plans for the dissolution or expansion of other countries? Okay, well, no side was really interested in the dissolution of their enemy state, at least at first. A lot of politicians, and certainly kings and emperors of the warring nations, they believed in the power system of the 19th century, and they wanted to keep that system. But the demands certainly changed and grew as the war grew longer and longer, and the sacrifices in men and money had to be worth the terrible cost. So for France, it was no longer just about things like getting Alsace-Lorraine back in 1918. And instead, they most certainly wanted to weaken Germany to the point where it would be impossible to have another war, like limiting their army, taking away a lot of their economic areas, like in the Ruhr area, and giving them huge war reparations to pay. The German interests were similar, if not even larger, with regards to the occupation plans of the maximalists, we'll call them, in the East, like Romania, Serbia, Albania. Those countries would most likely not have existed anymore if the Central Powers had won the war in 1918. Heck, you could already see their intentions when they stripped Russia of 1/3 of its population and 90% of its coal mining in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. Interestingly enough, the only one who really wanted no one to really win like that because of the resulting power shift was American President Woodrow Wilson. He knew that the winning side would rearrange the power balance in Europe so drastically that it would not only threaten a future war on the continent, but also the economic power of the U.S. Ironically, Wilson was probably the most 20th century politician of the nations involved. He pushed the self-determination agenda to create a new system of balance to hopefully guarantee a long-lasting peace. We will hear a lot more of his plans and the peace treaties and all that in the months to come. Let's see. Corey Hammerton. Love the show. You guys are doing an amazing job. My question for Out of the Trenches is this. With all the fighting on all the fronts and the advance of the enemy, there must have been a high number of people displaced by the war, but I found little to no mention of them anywhere, with the exception of the Armenian genocide. Were there any humanitarian efforts to aid the refugees and displaced people during the war and return them to their homes after the war? Oh, we've talked about a bunch of them, actually. Well, the Great War caused an enormous refugee and humanitarian crisis in many areas of the world. You had Belgian refugees who had to leave their country for the Netherlands or Great Britain, French refugees from the occupied areas fleeing to the west of their country, Serbian refugees that had to flee through the snowy mountains towards Albania or Corfu or towards Italy or even northern Africa. Those Serbs who returned after the war would return to a whole different country. Russian refugees, like the French, fled from the war but towards the east, but after the revolution, other Russian refugees would flee from the Bolsheviks towards the war-ravished areas of Western Russia, which now, again, was a whole different country, and they would settle there. The Quakers, the Red Cross, and other humanitarian organizations did admirable relief work for all the displaced people they could reach, but other parts of the world saw really terrible fate for countless thousands of refugees. In parts of the dying Ottoman Empire, the Caucasus, revolutionary Russia, steps towards ethnic cleansing and the forced displacement of people were taking place. By religion or by ethnicity, people were killed by the thousands or forced to flee their country and settle somewhere else. The turmoil of civil war literally burned the records of these people, so we don't have exact numbers, but the demographic changes that took place were enormous. While most refugees of Western Europe could simply eventually return to their company and rebuild their homes, the people in many other parts of the world affected by the war and the strife that followed were not so lucky and often had no more home to ever return to. If you'd like to see our episode about Serbian refugees' exodus through Albania, you can click right here for that. And do not forget to like us on Facebook and think about us all the time and write us letters and emails, yeah? Yeah. Emails too. See you next time.